This is Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. This is where I did my doctoral work. This is where I met Dr. Barrow, a well-known analytic philosopher. What is an analytic philosopher, you might wonder? Well, simply, an analytic philosopher analyzes concepts, words, and language. As an analytic philosopher interested in education, Dr. Barrow analyzed the concept of education so that we might understand what education means better than what we get from a dictionary definition. Education, according to Dr. Barrow, is, among other things, the achievement of a depth and breadth of understanding. What does this mean, a depth and breadth of understanding? This is what he says in his book, The Philosophy of Schooling. He says, "It may be argued that schooling should concern itself with the whole person. However, what I am suggesting here is that education, far from being concerned with all dimensions of the personality, it is essentially to do with the mind, and is purely cognitive, to do with knowledge, understanding, and perception. Surely it does not strike one as intelligible to reckon whether a person is more or less well educated by reference to such things as physique, athletic prowess, capacity for love, moral stature, emotional maturity, imaginative powers, or creative capacity. The fact that somebody is morally repugnant to me does not, in itself, show that person to be uneducated. The fact that somebody is emotionally immature is likewise not an indication that he or she is uneducated. And the fact that somebody has a great capacity for love, though no doubt admirable, is not to the point either." I like what Dr. Barrow says here. We are already getting a clearer sense of what education means than what we found in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Anyway, he continues, "What then do we look for in estimating whether a person is more or less educated? We judge him by his understanding and his capacity for discrimination, or his ability to recognize or perceive the difference between things." So this is good. Dr. Barrow started with understanding and added the idea of recognizing or perceiving differences between things. Someone who can tell the difference between one thing and another, or one idea and another, or one situation and another, would be demonstrating the ability to discriminate between things, and thus showing signs of being educated. If you can't discriminate between, say, a bicycle and a wagon, if you don't know the difference between a bicycle and a wagon, we would wonder how well you understand either one. If you can't discriminate between football and rugby, we would wonder how well you understand either one. The more understanding you have, the better you are able to discriminate between things. And if you don't know the difference between education and schooling, we would wonder how well you understand either. He continues, "To educate a person is to develop understandings and the capacity to make discriminations. And schools, if they are seeking to educate, must contribute to such development." So let's think about that. Did the second grade teacher teaching the 3 branches of government to second graders do a good job of helping them understand aspects of government well enough that they were able to discriminate between one thing or another? No. Not even being able to state the 3 branches from memory indicates any sort of discrimination. Let's continue. He makes a great point regarding knowledge and understanding here. He says, "I deliberately say understanding rather than knowledge, because the word knowledge can imply mere possession of a stock of information, and that does not seem appropriate. A walking Guinness Book of Records or a Mr. Memory is not as such an educated person. We expect the educated person to have understanding of the reason why of things, or a grasp of the underlying principles. Let me repeat that. I think this is important. He says we expect the educated person to have understanding of the reason why of things, or a grasp of the underlying principles, and not simply know-how or a collection of pieces of information. Let's think about that for a second. So it's not enough to simply know how to do something. You might know how to state pi r squared, for example, and fill in a formula and come up with a correct answer to a problem, and yet have little understanding of what you just did. Did the second grade child know the reasons why we have 3 branches of government? No. Did the child know the underlying principles that contributed to the formation of the 3 branches of government? No. Was she a walking mismemory? Well, for a short time, yes. But being a mismemory says little about actually being educated. Barrow continues. We expect the educated person to have understanding of the reason why of things or a grasp of the underlying principles, and not simply know-how or a collection of pieces of information. Barrow says, the fact that you know that Franklin D. Roosevelt was re-elected President of the United States for the 3rd term of office on November 5th, 1940, does not reveal to us whether you are relatively well or poorly educated. Nor would the fact that you also know the election dates of all the other American presidents suggest any the more that you are an educated person. Okay. So simply knowing facts and dates doesn't make you an educated person, even if you sat in a class, were taught by a teacher, and scored well on a test that tested those facts and dates. He continues, but if it becomes apparent that besides knowing the date of Roosevelt's 3rd term, you also have some sensible things to say about how and why he won it, you are beginning to show the sort of signs that we look for in judging whether people are more or less educated. Now listen to this. Barrow makes an important point here. He says, just to be on the safe side, let me stress the phrase, the sort of signs. I am not suggesting that knowing about Roosevelt is a necessary condition of being educated. I am using Roosevelt as an example to illustrate the sort of thing educated people, by definition, should have the understanding of. Explanations of political success rather than dates. So even if our 2nd grade child remembered the definitions of the 3 branches of government, would she be, by definition, educated? No. She was unable to provide any sorts of explanations regarding any of the government branches. Let's go on. Education implies some breadth of understanding rather than narrow specialism, however profound or erudite that specialist knowledge might be. Erudite means having or showing great knowledge. So he's saying that even if you have a great amount of knowledge in a very narrow area, that alone won't make you educated. He says, a brilliant historian or a front-rank scientist is not necessarily an educated person. And if a person's historical common sense or practical intelligence or understanding or that person's scientific know-how was all that that person had, we should not take that person as the epitome of an educated individual. So even if you have a great deal of understanding in one area, we wouldn't say that you're educated. So we are already further along than our dictionary definitions had provided. Our dictionary definitions didn't refer to a depth and breadth of understanding. Our dictionary definitions didn't mention understanding at all. And if we are to agree with Dr. Barrow, the educated person must have a breadth and depth of understanding. I think that's a great place to start our initial considerations of education. But does everyone need the same depth and breadth of understanding to be educated? Barrow speaks to this. He says, any educated person must by definition have a breadth of understanding. But different people may arrive at a breadth in different ways. For example, a scientist who knows no history but knew something about literature and beekeeping might reasonably count as being to some extent educated, whilst a theologian who was also something of a botanist and a philosopher, though having little specifically in common with the scientist, might also. Implicit in everything Barrow says thus far is the obvious truth that education is a matter of degree. People are not simply educated or not, they are to a greater or lesser extent educated. I think that helps us a great deal already. Dr. Barrow does mention some other specifics, but I think we have a place to start. Let me mention one more thing. I mentioned it earlier. That is discrimination. He says, the possession of precise and particular concepts gives one discriminatory power. That is, maneuverability and penetrating power in thought that the ability to make fine discriminations provides. What he means here is that when discussing diverse matters, one's contribution will be more significant and illuminating. One's thinking will be better, insofar as one is in possession of more clear and specific concepts. If you cannot get beyond broad and general concepts, you cannot contribute much. We must remember that it is a question of both clarity and specificity. That's interesting, isn't it? We now have a much better sense of what education might mean and that which might be necessary to become educated. Try asking 10 different people what education means. Do they give you an educated answer? In other words, is there clarity and precision to their response? Are they making clear distinctions? Are they able to discriminate between schooling and education? Or do the boundaries seem blurry? Rightfully, I believe Barrow makes the important distinction in his discussion between knowledge and understanding. One might know something but not understand it. Someone might learn something and yet not understand it. Also, someone possessing a good deal of information does not suggest that they have a depth and breadth of understanding or are in any way educated. I think what Barrow says is interesting. If our concern is to educate, then, according to Barrow, our responsibility is to help students achieve a depth and breadth of understanding. So we might ask, with every pedagogical activity we undertake as teachers, are we helping our students achieve a depth and breadth of understanding? Presumably, had the second grade teacher asked herself whether her students were achieving a depth and breadth of understanding, she would have realized that the activity didn't do much to elicit any understanding and was therefore inappropriate in the context of education. Presumably, had the administrators asked themselves whether or not children were developing an understanding by forcing them to memorize the 3 branches of government for a state test, they would have realized the pursuit was a waste of time and inappropriate in the context of education. Had the test makers and the politicians who forced standardized tests onto schools, teachers, and children a genuine concern with understanding, they would have realized the form of testing was inappropriate in the context of education. These activities were not helping children develop a depth and breadth of understanding. This idea of understanding seems simple enough. Am I fulfilling my responsibility as an educator if I am teaching my students and they are not developing an understanding of the content at hand? Am I helping my students achieve a depth and breadth of understanding? These are important questions. But we have to ask, what is understanding? We know that understanding is not simply knowing something. For example, I may know the 3 branches of government and be able to state what those branches are, but that is not an indication that I understand anything about legislative, executive, or judicial workings. I think we could say that Barrow believes that understanding has to do with the recognition of causes. Understanding is based on language and reason, according to Barrow. Understanding exists within a context. Simply put, if I have an understanding of something, I can give reasons why things are the way they are. If a child understands the 3 branches of government, presumably that child can say something about the reasons why we have 3 branches. And to give reasons, one would have to have some understanding of the underlying principles. We would presume that the child could say something about the purpose, the form, the materials, the people involved, the background, regarding why we have a legislative or judicial branch, or even why we have governments. A couple points to keep in mind. Dr. Barrow suggests to us that one must have a depth and breadth of understanding to be considered educated. And one demonstrates that understanding by knowing the underlying principles of a topic of concern, and knowing enough about a topic to begin to clearly and precisely discriminate between that topic and another. He does not say how one develops an understanding. That is something we will have to consider more as we move forward in our explorations. However, given what we know thus far, what does all of this mean for us as future teachers? Well, regardless of the purpose behind the schooling, we are, above all, educators. Our job is to educate students. Education is the achievement of a depth and breadth of understanding. What does this mean in terms of ensuring that we are continually educating ourselves? Something I hope that you would start doing immediately. We have to maintain a preoccupation with developing our own depth and breadth of understanding. We should now recognize that schooling and education are not identical. Schooling is, hopefully, something that is meant to help people become educated, though we know that is not always the case. It is clear to us that one does not need to attend school to become educated, and it is also very clear that school can be a very powerful place for some individuals to become educated. It should also becoming apparent that some teachers, very good teachers, concern themselves with helping their students develop a depth and breadth of understanding. So I'm left with a couple of questions now regarding foundations of education. That's where we started all of this. Wouldn't we have to say that the foundations of education are really the foundations of understanding? And wouldn't schooling, if it is concerned with educating, have to contribute to the development of understanding?